that they really seem to be these figures that stand out as extraordinary for one in one way or another. Remembering, by the way, that almost all the history of them were written by the enemies that they so mistreated that they were probably never going to get any good press. They didn't write themselves.
That's a caveat we should always add to basically all
nomadic or Native American peoples or tribal peoples anywhere generally do not get the advantage of being able to write the history of their heroes.
Okay, I've recently almost done with The Rise and the Fall of the Third Reich. It's one of the historical descriptions of Hitler's rise to power, Nazis' rise to power. There's a few philosophical things I'd like to ask you to see if you can help. Like one of the things I think about is how does one be a hero in 1930s Nazi Germany? What does it mean to be a hero? What do heroic actions look like? I think about that because I think about how I move about in this world today. You know, that we live in really chaotic and tense times where I don't think you want to draw any parallels between Nazi Germany and modern day in any of the nations we can think about, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that authoritarian governments take hold, authoritarian companies take hold, and I'd like to think that I could be, in my little small way, and inspire others to take the heroic action before things get bad. And I kind of try to place myself in what would 1930s Germany look like. Is it possible to stop a Hitler? Is it even the right way to think about it? And how does one be a hero in it? I mean, you often talk about that living through a moment in history is very different than looking at that history, when you look back. I also think about would it be possible to understand what's happening, that the bells of war are ringing. It seems that most people didn't seem to understand, late into the 30s, that war is coming. That's fascinating. On the United States side, inside Germany, like the opposing figures, the German military didn't seem to understand this. Maybe the other countries, certainly France and England, didn't seem to understand this. So I kind of tried to put myself into 1930s, 30s Germany, as I'm Jewish, which is another little twist on the whole. Like, what would I do? What should one do? Do you have interesting answers?
So earlier we had talked about Putin and we had talked about patriotism and love of country and those sorts of things. In order to be a hero in Nazi Germany, by our views here, you would have had to have been anti-patriotic to the average German's viewpoint in the 1930s, right? You would have to have opposed your own government and your own country. And it would be a very weird thing to go to people in Germany and say, listen, the only way you're going to be seen as a good German and a hero to the country that will be your enemies is we think you should oppose your own government. It's a strange position to put the people in a government in, saying you need to be against your leader, you need to oppose your government's policies, you need to oppose your government, you need to hope and work for its downfall. That doesn't sound patriotic. It wouldn't sound patriotic here in this country if you made a similar argument. I will go away from the 1930s and go to the 1940s to answer your question. So there's movements like the White Rose movement in Germany, which involved young people, really, and from various backgrounds, religious backgrounds often, who worked openly against the Nazi government at a time when power was already consolidated, the Gestapo was in full force, and they execute people who are against the government. And these young people would go out and distribute pamphlets and many of them got their heads cut off with guillotines for their trouble. And they knew that was going to be the penalty. That is a remarkable amount of bravery and sacrifice and willingness to die, and almost not even willingness, because they were so open about it. It's almost a certainty, right? Um, that's incredibly moving to me. So when we talk, and we had talked earlier about sort of the human spirit and all that kind of thing, there are people in the German military who opposed and worked against Hitler, for example. But to me, that's almost cowardly compared to what these young people did in the White Rose movement, because those people in the Wehrmacht, for example, who were secretly trying to undermine Hitler, they're not really putting their lives on the line to the same degree. And so I think when I look at heroes, and listen, I remember once saying there were no conscientious objectors in Germany as a way to point out to people that you didn't have a choice. You were going to serve in there. And I got letters from Jehovah's Witnesses who said, yes, there were. And we got sent to the concentration camps. Those are remarkably brave things. It's one thing to have your own set of standards and values. It's another thing to say, oh no, I'm going to display them in a way that with this regime, that's a death sentence. And not just for me, for my family, right? In these regimes, there was not a lot of distinction made between father and son and wives. That's a remarkable sacrifice to make, and far beyond what I think I would even be capable of. And so the admiration comes from seeing people who appear to be more morally profound than you are yourself. So when I look at this, I look at that kind of thing, and I just say, wow. And the funny thing is, if you'd have gone to most average Germans on the street in 1942 and said, what do you think of these people? They're going to think of them as traitors who probably got what they deserved. So that's the eye of the beholder thing. It's the power of the state to so propagandize values and morality in a way that favors the state, that you can turn people who today we look at as unbelievably brave and moral and crusading for righteousness, and turn them into enemies of the people. So, I mean, in my mind, it would be people like that.
See, I think so. Hero is a funny word, and we romanticize the notion. But if I could drag you back to 1930s Germany from 1940s,
Sure.
I feel like the heroic actions that doesn't accomplish much is not what I'm referring to. So
Okay.
there's many heroes I look up to that, like David Goggins, for example, the guy who runs crazy distances. He runs for no purpose except for the suffering in itself. And I think his willingness to challenge the limits of his mind is heroic. I guess I'm looking for a different term, which is, how could Hitler have been stopped? My sense is that he could have been stopped in the battle of ideas, where people, millions of people, were suffering economically, were suffering because of the betrayal of World War I in terms of the love of country and how they felt they were being treated. And a charismatic leader that inspired love and unity that's not destructive could have emerged, and that's where the battle should have been fought.
I would suggest that we need to take into account the context of the times that led to Hitler's rise of power, and created the conditions where his message resonated. That is not a message that resonates at all times, right? It is impossible to understand the rise of Hitler without dealing with the First World War and the aftermath of the First World War and the inflationary, terrible depression in Germany and all these things, and the dissatisfaction with the Weimar Republic's government, which was often seen as something which it was put into place by the victorious powers. Hitler referred to the people that signed those agreements, that signed the armistice, as the November criminals. And he used that as a phrase which resonated with the population. This was a population that was embittered. And even if they weren't embittered, the times were so terrible, and the options for operating within the system in a radical way seemed totally discredited, right? I mean, you could work through the Weimar Republic, but they tried and it wasn't working anyway. And then the alternative to the Nazis, who were bully boys in the street, were communist agitators that to the average conservative German seemed no better. So you have three options if you're an average German person. You can go with the discredited government put in power by your enemies that wasn't working anyway.
Mhm.
You could go with the Nazis, who seemed like a bunch of super patriots calling for the restoration of German authority, or you could go with the communists. And the entire thing seemed like a litany of poor options, right? And in this realm, Hitler was able to triangulate, if you will. He came off as a person who was going to restore German greatness at a time when this was a powerful message. But if you don't need German greatness restored, it doesn't resonate, right? So the reason that your love idea and all this stuff, I don't think would have worked in the time period is because that was not a commodity that the average German was in search of then.
Well, it's interesting to think about whether greatness could be restored through mechanisms, through ideas that are not so, from our perspective today, so evil. I don't know what the right term is.
But the war continued in a way. So remember that when Hitler is rising to power, the French are in control of parts of Germany, right? The Ruhr, one of the main industrial heartlands of Germany, was occupied by the French. So there's never this point where you're allowed to let the hate dissipate, right? Every time maybe things were calming down, something else would happen to stick the knife in and twist it a little bit more from the average German's perspective, right? The reparations, right? So if you say, okay, well, we're going to get back on our feet, the reparations were crushing. These things prevented the idea of love or brotherhood and all these things from taking hold. And even if there were Germans who felt that way, and there most certainly were, it is hard to overcome the power of everyone else. You know, what I always say when people talk to me about humanity is I believe on an individual levels, we're capable of everything and anything, good, bad, or indifferent. But collectively, it's different, right? And in the time period that we're talking about here, messages of peace on earth and love your enemies and all these sorts of things were absolutely deluged and overwhelmed and drowned out by the bitterness, the hatred, and let's be honest, the sense that you were continually being abused by your former enemies. There were a lot of people in the Allied side that realized this and said, we're setting up the next war. They understood that you can only do certain things to collective human populations for a certain period of time before it is natural for them to want to. And you can see German posters from the region, Nazi propaganda posters that show them breaking off the chains of their enemies. And I mean, Germany awake, right? That was the great slogan. So I think love is always a difficult option. And in the context of those times, it was even more disempowered than normal.
Well, this goes to just to linger on it for a little longer, the question of the inevitability of history. Do you think Hitler could have been stopped? Do you think this kind of force that you're saying that there was a pain and it was building, there was a hatred that was building, do you think there was a way to avert? I mean, there's two questions. Could it have been a lot worse? And could it have been better in the trajectory of history in the 30s and 40s?
The most logical, see, we had started this conversation, it brings a wonderful bow tie into the discussion and buttons it up nicely. We had talked about force and counterforce earlier. The most obvious and much discussed way that Hitler could have been stopped has nothing to do with Germans. When he remilitarized the Rhineland, everyone talks about what a couple of French divisions would have done had they simply gone in and contested. And this was something Hitler was it might have been the most nervous time in his entire career because he was afraid that they would have responded with force, and he was in no position to do anything about it if they did. So this is where you get the people who say, and Churchill's one of these people too, where they talk about that he should have been stopped militarily right at the very beginning when he was weak. I don't think. listen, there were candidates in the Catholic Center Party and others in the Weimar Republic that maybe could have done things, and it's beyond my understanding of specific German history to talk about it intelligently. But I do think that had the French responded militarily to Hitler's initial moves into that area, that he would have been thwarted. And I think he himself believed, if I'm remembering my reading, that this would have led to his downfall. So the potential, see, and what I don't like about this is that it almost legitimizes military intervention at a very early stage to prevent worse things from happening. But it might be a pretty clear-cut case. But it should also be pointed out that there was a lot of sympathy on the part of the Allies for the fact that, the Germans probably should have Germany back, and this is traditional German land. And I mean, they were trying, in a funny way, it's almost like the love and the sense of justice on the Allies' part may have actually stayed their hand in a way that would have prevented much, much, much worse things later. But if the times were such that the message of a Hitler resonated, then simply removing Hitler from the equation would not have removed the context of the times. And that means one of two things. Either you could have had another one, or you could have ended up in a situation equally bad in a different direction. I don't know what that means, because it's hard to imagine anything could be worse than what actually occurred. But history's funny that way. And that Hitler's always everyone's favorite example of the difference between the great man theory of history and the trends and forces theories of history, right? The times made a Hitler possible and maybe even desirable to some. If you took him out of the equation, those trends and forces are still in place, right? So what does that mean? If you take him out and the door is still open, does somebody else walk through it?
Yeah, it's mathematically speaking, the probability of charismatic leaders emerge. I'm so torn on that. I'm at this point.
Here's another way to look at it. The institutional stability of Germany in that time period was not enough to push back. And there are other periods in German history. I mean, that Hitler arisen in 1913, he doesn't get anywhere, because Germany's institutional power is enough to simply quash that. It's the fact that Germany was unstable anyway that prevented a united front that would have kept radicalism from getting out of hand. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. A tricky question on this, just to stay on this a little longer, because I'm not sure how to think about it, is the World War II versus the Holocaust. When we were talking just now about the way that history unrolls itself, and could Hitler have been stopped? And I don't quite know what to think about Hitler without the Holocaust, and perhaps in his thinking how essential the anti-Semitism and the hatred of Jews was. It feels to me that, I mean, I don't know. We were just talking about, where did he pick up his hatred of the Jewish people? There's stories in Vienna and so on that it almost is picking up the idea of anti-Semitism as a really useful tool, as opposed to actually believing it in its core. Do you think World War II, as it turned out, and Hitler as he turned out, would be possible without anti-Semitism? Could we have avoided the Holocaust? Or was it an integral part of the ideology of fascism and the Nazis?
Not an integral part of fascism, because Mussolini really, I mean, Mussolini did it to please Hitler, but it wasn't an integral part. What's interesting to me is that that's the big anomaly in the whole question, because anti-Semitism didn't need to be a part of this at all, right? Hitler had a conspiratorial view of the world. He was a believer that the Jews controlled things, right? The Jews were responsible for both Bolshevism on one side and capitalism on the other. They ruled the banks. I mean, the United States was a Jewified country, right? Bolshevism was a Jewified sort of a political. In other words, he saw Jews everywhere, and he had that line about if the Jews of Europe force another war to Germany, they'll pay the price or whatever. But then you have to believe that they're capable of that. The Holocaust is a weird sidebar to the whole thing. And here's what I've always found interesting: it's a sidebar that weakened Germany. Because look at the First World War. Jews fought for Germany, right? Who was the most important? And this is a very arguable point, but it's just the first one that pops into my head. Who was the most important Jewish figure that would have maybe been on the German side had the Germans had a non-anti-Semitic, well, listen, that whole part of Europe,
Einstein
yes, it was Einstein. But the whole, I should point out that to say Germany or Europe or Russia or any of those things were not anti-Semitic is to do injustice to history, right? Pogroms everywhere. I mean, that is it's standard operating procedure. What you see in the Hitlerian era is an absolute huge spike, right? Because the government has a conspiracy theory that the Jews have. It's funny because Hitler both thought of them as weak and super powerful at the same time, right? And as an outsider people that weakened Germany, I mean, the whole idea of the blood and how that connects to Darwinism and all that sort of stuff is just weird, right? A real outlier. But Einstein, let's just play with Einstein. If there's no anti-Semitism in Germany, or none above the normal level, right? The baseline level. Does Einstein leave along with all the other Jewish scientists? And I mean, and what does Germany have as increased technological and intellectual capacity if they stay? Right? It's something that actually weakened that state. It's a tragic flaw in the Hitlerian worldview. But it was so, and I do, you had mentioned earlier, like maybe it was not integral to his character. Maybe it was a wonderful tool for power. I don't think so. Somewhere along the line, and really not at the beginning, this guy became absolutely obsessed with this.
With a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, and Jews. And he surrounded himself with people and theorists, I'm going to use that word really sort of loosely, who believe this too. And so you have a cabal of people who are reinforcing this idea that the Jews control the world, that he called it international Jewry was a huge part of the problem, and that because of that, they deserved to be punished. They were an enemy within, all these kinds of things. It's a nutty conspiracy theory that the government of one of the most, I mean, the big thing with Germany was culture, right? They were a leading figure in culture and philosophy and all these kinds of things, and that they could be overtaken with this wildly, wickedly weird conspiracy theory, and that it would actually determine things. I mean, Hitler was taking vast amounts of German resources and using it to wipe out this race when he needed them for all kinds of other things, to fight a war of annihilation. So that is the weirdest part of the whole Nazi phenomenon.
It's the darkest possible silver lining to think about, is that the Holocaust may have been, and the hatred of the Jewish people may have been the thing that avoided Germany getting the nuclear weapons first. And
isn't that a wonderful historical ironic twist, that if it weren't so overlaid with tragedy, 1,000 years from now will be seen as something really kind of funny?
Well, that's true. It's fascinating to think, as you've talked
about, sowed the seeds of his own destruction, right? The tragic flaw.